Right, so welcome everyone to another session of Straxferno. Thanks for everyone for sticking in there until the fourth circle. I believe this is the circle of greed. I think in hell this is where they push bags of money. People who've had too much hunger for things. Perhaps this symbolizes our hunger for data or of some kind. So today I hope we can do a bit of catch up, perhaps related to this greed. We had a very full program in the last times with several very nice presentations from several of you. So I hope that today we can first finish the questions that we had from last time we didn't get to. So those are on data loading and on mini analyses, and then I have a very small overview of a context for you, and then we can discuss basically those other topics of related to contexts. And as usual, end with a short preview of next week. So I think we should just jump right in. So let's get to data loading where we left off last time. So those things are in Strax. Let's see, so stuff like get array, get data frame. So who wants to take it away? Any questions on data loading? We covered a few questions last time, but probably not all of them. Sorry, just moving things around several monitors. Okay, it doesn't look like there are any questions on data loading then. That's fine. But if there are, please speak up. Okay, then let's move on to mini analyses. So mini analyses. So I gave a short demo last time. Right, I can briefly show that again. Right, so remember mini analyses were these small functions like plot energy spectrum, waveform plotting, other ways you can do something small with the data. Were there any questions on that?
I have a general question on mini analysis.
Sure.
It was answered already. Yeah. So what's the point of having them as decorator? So why this approach? Which is the strong point for this? Mm-hmm. Something I didn't really get.
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's look at one. So for example, here plot peaks AFT histogram, or no, maybe a simpler one. Let's take plot energy spectrum. It's as good as any other. So yeah, what the decorator thing does is it takes a function and it changes into another function. So in this case, it takes a function which I defined, which is just something that given events, plots an energy spectrum of those events, and changes it into something which you can call in somewhat easier ways. You don't have to first load the events or apply selections, whatever you want to do. You can event selection for the run ID, and it automatically loads those events. So it sort of does a little bit extra compared to the function that you originally defined. It's like it defines an extra bit of feature to that function. That's exactly what a decorator does. Now, this is only one example. There are more complex mini analyses where, for example, let's look at one in the waveform plotting. right? So here you have, okay, that's not the best one to go. Right here, plot peaks, for example, that plots like the S1 and the S2 peak in the waveforms that you saw. That takes here a reference time, which if the user doesn't pass it, that's automatically filled in as the start time of the run. So it's again an extra feature to add to this function, just to give it so some extra information, even if the user doesn't pass it. You can also see here that you can control the behavior of how this extra little bit works. So that you here it says, well, these are the things I require. So if you load data, then you need to load these data. And this is another extra like bell or whistle that's added, where if the user requests too much, you get a warning. So it's adding a series of features to a user-defined function, and the decorator is doing exactly that.
Yeah, so in the end, it also helps us if we want to write a new mini analysis, because we just take care of how we want to plot, what we want to plot, but then we just add all the the other features that the mini analysis. So they are given to us for free, let's say, all the other features.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's adding this Strax.mini analysis thing.
Yeah, it's a lightweight way of doing that. But of course, decorators aren't the solution to everything, right? We didn't choose, for example, to implement our plugins as decorators, which, looking at some plugins, you might say, why not, right? If I some of the higher level plugins, like here, for example, energy estimates, right? This is a pretty simple plugin. It just a little bit stuff here. You might think, hey, could I've, rather than requiring the user to make a plugin, I could have said, well, let the user just write a function, and then there's a decorator on top of that says, these are the config options, these are the D type, this is everything else. And we didn't do that. And the reason is, of course, that decorator so long, because you have to put all of these options in there, certainly for more complicated plugins, right? You have the DAQ reader here, you have this whole string of options, different provides things, different ways of inferring the data type. So it's much more than just adding a little bit of a bell and a whistle to a function. It's, sure, the actual compute function is part of it, but there's all this other stuff. So then a decorator is maybe not the most user-friendly way of doing it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I have a small question.
Sure, Peter.
The mini analysis, you have this decorator and it has some arguments. How can you easily change those default arguments to something else?
How can you change the default arguments to something else? Okay, let's look at one. So here, for example, you mean like this, like requires event info.
Yes.
And you're saying, suppose I want to make a new mini analysis, like plot energy spectrum, but a different.
No, if you go up, there was one of the mini analysis which had time range touching.
Yeah.
Right? Or something touching.
Yeah, I think it was in waveform plots. Yeah. Yeah, there it was. Default time selection touching. Yeah.
Yeah. So what if I want that to be something else? Can I do that easily?
So if you're a user and you're using this mini analysis, so you can time selection is an argument. It's an argument for mini analyses. Let's see where it is, or at least it should be. Here's default time selection kind. Right, so you can pass the option time selection, and the default for that option is what's set here. But if you pass a different option, then that should also work. We can check, we can try it. So let's say plot energy spec. No, we need one where this default works, right? So which one did we have? Plot peaks. Okay. There's a small issue here. If you actually select a time range where peak is at the edge of the range, you currently just get an error due to some Strax bug. There's an issue there. So we can try testing this, but in the situation where this option matters, you would normally just get an error.
Okay, but you can just specify the argument in calling the function and then it should work.
Yeah, that's the idea. So you can just so you do time selection equals touching or whatever it is. Just like get array really. So there's get array, should be an option here, time selection, where you can pass fully contained, touching, or skip.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So that's true for this argument. If you have other things like this warn beyond seconds, okay, so this you cannot easily change, but you can ignore it. There is an option, ignore time warning equals true. I think we might have we seen that somewhere? No, okay, but you can enter into the situation where you're plodding away from it and saying, oh, you really sure you want to do that? And you can pass ignore a time warning equals false. There are other things like this requires, yeah, you can't change that because what it requires. So you can write a new mini analysis that doesn't require it, but this one does. So. Okay, more questions. Mini analyses. So is it clear to everyone when you make a mini analysis and when you make a plugin? How would you answer if somebody asks you that?
Well, for an histogram or a fit, a mini analysis is good. If you have to create like a new variable, or I mean to pass through all the data, or calculate, for example, a variable in a different way, a plugin with the fit.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right.
A plugin is a sort of component that you, in principle, you can also combine with other components that are developed after your plugin. While the mini analysis is a sort of, the idea is to have something that is standalone and finish with it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very good. Those are the essential sort of the two essential differences. That on the one hand, a plugin just adds a little bit of data to all of the data in the run, whereas a mini analysis is just takes the whole run as a whole. And on the other hand, a mini analysis sort of ends the whole chain of the Strax framework. It's not that outputs a data type with a configuration that you can then build upon. It just outputs a plot or a number or whatever. So you can have mini analyses calling other mini analyses, but that's just like you can have functions calling any other functions. There's no special mechanism for tracking the options and for keeping track of versions. As soon as you've left the plugin domain, that's the end of that. Yeah, very good. Okay, let's see if there were any other questions here. Oh, yeah, I think this is an interesting one. So why does this, right? So this is how mini analyses are defined. So here I have defined the mini analysis, then there's def decorator, and then there's another definition. So I've got here two nested definitions. Why do I need two of them? Couldn't I use just like one or maybe zero? What's the point of this?
Okay, I'm not sure, but for what I could find regarding decorator, okay, the decorator itself needs the decorator and the wrapped function inside. I mean, just for how it works. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to pass argument to a decorator, you need a decorator maker on top. So there were examples with these two nested function, but I don't know if exactly the case. So.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. So the reason is that you need to pass arguments to your decorator. Mm-hmm. So actually this mini analysis thing, that isn't a decorator, it's a decorator generator, if you will. So it's something you can pass arguments to, okay, right? And then that will generate a decorator, which is something you can pass a function to, and that generates a function. Yeah.
Okay, so it's because we want to pass arguments to assert the decorator.
Yeah, no, okay. You're completely right. Yeah.
Okay, got it right.
Okay, So did anybody maybe try adding a hard-coded blinding cut somewhere to Strax? Where would we do this? This relates maybe more to data loading than to mini analyses, but any idea what kind of function you want to modify?
You could do that just with like a plugin that shows up somewhere after the correction stage, and then just drops CS1 less than 50 from the output, and otherwise just passes everything through. Mm-hmm. Or you could do it when it's actually, this would be probably in what, get iter, where it's actually pulling data from disk.
Yeah, put it in get array or get iter and just make a default selection string. Like you always throw away this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now those are all nice options. So we have change one of the plugins, get iter, get array, and then specifically the selection string. Sounds good. Anybody had a different implementation than these? No, I think these are the main choices. Okay, now suppose you're the Strax maintainer. You have to decide which one do you think is long term the most feasible.
I guess a plugin, because that's way more flexible than hard coding it in some often used function.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a bad idea.
Wouldn't you maybe also do it in corrected energies where you actually compute CS1, CS2, because then you just have to rerun that plugin rather than having to rely on the analyzers to throw away their data if some Boolean array is true.
Yeah, so this is a good point. If you do it in a plugin, definitely don't do it in some low-level plugin, because then if you need to unblind, you need to reprocess the data. You don't want to do that. So indeed, you do it in a high-level plugin if you do it in a plugin at all. Yeah, that makes sense. So how about the selection string option? What was the problem with that?
So I think if you hide it somewhere far away, deep in some obscure function nobody ever looks at, it's easy to lose it. That it's hard to find.
Yeah.
And you would prefer it to be somewhat flexible, that the blinding cut is just this thing, and if I uncheck mark whatever this thing, then it's gone. It's a much cleaner way of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm listening. I don't have the answer to this myself. So I think these are very good considerations.
Do we have to make sure that user do not override it? If it is a plugin at the very end of the chain, maybe also somebody can forget it to call it, or I don't know.
Yeah, that is true. So if it's one of the last plugins, then maybe somebody will access an earlier plugin and then the blinding cut isn't applied.
Or maybe you can set it as like in the context option that you specify there already the selection string, which is always applied. And then you can easily remove it if you just change the context definition.
Yeah, that's a good point for the selection string option, that it's context dependent, and there it's easy to change, and everybody using that context will then have it regardless of which plugin you use.
The plugin that actually does the area corrections might be the best place to put it, because then you basically have a config option, you know, blind or not blind. You can version the blinding cut, because obviously you want your background data to be blinded, but you don't want your neutron calibration data to be blinded, because that kind of defeats the purpose of your neutron calibration data.
Yeah, that's a very good point. If you need to determine, there's like a run specific thing whether you apply the blinding cut or not. So run information comes into it. So then the plugin would have to, like fetch some information from the run doc. I mean, it could, but the context is a more natural place maybe to do that.
I mean, I assume once we're, finalizing analysis, we would have like the nton SR0 context, which I assume would know which runs to blind, which runs should not be blinded, and it could do it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, maybe just to provide context. So the way we did it in Xenon Wonton in HAX was that basically the data loading function, sort of the equivalent of get iter or get array in our case, was changed to say, are we loading a background run? Are you loading corrections? If so, then we apply basically this selection string in any case. So it is closest to that option. But I think the other solutions suggested here were perfectly fine. There are disadvantages and advantages to each. I don't have the answer, and I won't be the one implementing it. So these are all considerations to take into to the future. But at least you know now several ways of applying some blinding cut. So if there's some emergency, then you can all go into Strax and change a few lines and apply a blinding cut, right? So you can just here in apply selection, for instance, right? So here you can check for this this X thing. So I don't know exactly how we would do it, but if maybe you do something like try XCS1 except key error. Guess you're okay. Else apply blinding cut. Something like this. But this of course has the problem that it would apply to all runs rather than to only runs that you want. So that would be the next stage. You would here say, okay, what run are you actually loading? This thing doesn't take the run ID, so maybe this isn't the best place. Right, so that was the blinding cut. In general, for these exercises, I'm usually too lazy to make nice solutions myself. But if you think, yeah, I've got nice solutions, just post them on the course repo, and we will all be very grateful to you. Okay, so did this discussion probably lose any further questions on data loading and mini analyses before we move on to the topic of this week? I guess not. So then let's move on. So let's see. 2 motors, always interesting. Right, so this is just to remind you again where we are. So right, we've covered the user interface, we've covered the plugins, and this week and last week we're talking about different aspects of the context, not the very low level aspects, but the part that you still might interact with as a user or as an analysis developer. And next week we'll talk about the storage system, and then we really start diving into like sort of deep details that unless something is really wrong, you will never see as an analyst. So the context contains many things. It's sort of your data butler. I believe other experiments actually have this concept of a data butler. I don't know how we would have called the context otherwise, but so this is just a rough overview of the things that it does. You'll have seen many in last week's reading and in this week's reading. So sort of central to it are, I guess, the things that are sort of the state. So if you have a context, what sort of determines what state it's in, those are the things that are stored within it. So you got the configuration for the plugins, not to be confused with the configuration for the context, which is in a different dictionary. There can be some cached runs info, not super important, but that's just for run selection. And if you do run selection twice, you don't have to query the entire runs database again. And in storage, you have the different storage front ends, which we'll talk about next week. And finally, there's has an underscore, so it's not really nice to sort of start tinkering with it, but somewhere it's storing which plugins are registered. So I can just show you that. So if we have here, I've loaded a few contexts, so I can look in config. You can see here, this is the one-ton context. Let me change to the n-ton one, it's a bit neater. So you see, this is the configuration that's currently passed. There's very little in it because, well, as you've seen, there are many ways of specifying defaults, but this will be the plugin configuration, and context config is, it contains all the context configuration options. Where again, some options have defaults, but in this case, most of them are in here. You can see them in more detail with this show config thing, where if you give it nothing, it just shows you the configuration of the context, and if you give it some data type, it will show you the configuration of that data type. But today we're focusing on the contexts. So, okay. And by the way, it is okay to just modify these things. There are utility functions for doing this a bit nicer, and there's maybe some validation, but look, we're not going to send the police out to arrest you if you modify like context config to do something. I do it myself sometimes too. I forget that there exists this option called set context config that will do that for me and check that it didn't make a typo, etc. Maybe the nice one is this plugin class registry, because that's one that you won't normally have to deal with, but it's interesting maybe to see. Right, so this shows you there's a big dictionary with mapping data types to plugins, and you see some plugins appear multiple times. So if you're the pulse processing plugin, because that's a multi-output plugin, it appears several times. So this shows you, okay, if you have records, go to that plugin. If you have something else, you go to that plugin. And maybe of note, this is already going into too much detail, but this is a class of the plugin, not the instance of the plugin. So it is just sort of the thing that you define directly in the file, but it's without any instantiation of config options. Infer D type hasn't been called. It's just saying, okay, that's the plugin, and we can sort of do the whole setup later. Okay, you got a bunch of functions that deal with the main data, and we covered them last week. And even the weeks before. So get iter is the most low level one. Make just does get iter and nothing else. Don't forget about accumulate. It's a nice function to just run some function over every chunk, or maybe sum up the results or something. And you're familiar with these three already. There's sort of a mirror set of functions for metadata. So you've seen two sets of metadata this week. There's run metadata from the run document. That's the same stuff you can find on the DAQ website. And there's data level metadata, which really describes every individual data type. So that contains like the information on how much data is in which chunk, what time range does that correspond to, what's the exact options that were used for processing this data, etc. And there's a couple of functions for querying this in an easier way. For example, size megabytes, we've covered that before, right? So what that just does is it gets the metadata, and then it loops through the chunk info in that metadata and sums up the bytes. So it's just a utility function for getting the size. Okay. You also have a few functions. Aaron, you had a question.
Yes. What if I didn't find any metadata from a given run? What that means is just we don't save that metadata, or?
Sure. Yeah. So if there's no run metadata,
and I found it says we didn't find any metadata for this run.
Okay. So yeah, you tried to run metadata, right? So run metadata. So you got this error.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So if if you're running in the Xenon Anton context, and this is a real run that's also in the DAQ database, that would be really odd, because the Xenon Anton context can go to the DAQ database. I mean the runs database, of course, which happens, of course, to be managed by the DAQ group. But okay, so this goes to the runs database, and if the run is there, then this should be there. But as you can see, one way of getting this error is just mistyping the run name. For example, common one is forgetting the double zeros in front of it. If I have the Anton context, let's see, are we at 8,000 yet? I guess we are at 8,000. Yeah, so this works. Oh, this also works. Isn't that nice? I guess put that in. Well, let me put a P in there. Now it doesn't work. Invalid literal. Okay. I don't know what it's trying, but okay. So that's one way to get it. Another way, which might happen in the one-ton context, is that there really isn't run metadata, because in the one-ton context, the way we get run metadata is not from the runs database. We could have done that, but we don't. We have all these run metadata JSONs. So if I just go there.
Yeah, what I was doing is basically I look into the electron lifetime file. And there's a bunch of runs, and I try some of them, and some of them don't have metadata.
Okay, so that's for Xenon one-ton, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I can give you one example, one
Sure.
number.
Right, I'm just showing here the folder where we store the Xenon one-ton converted raw data. And all these JSON files, that is the actual metadata. So this is just copied from the runs database and slightly reformatted to match the new format. I don't think there's much reformatting. So if it's not in here, if we haven't converted the data, then yeah, you'll get an error.
Okay, probably it's converted. Okay.
So if you have an electron lifetime file from some Xenon one-ton analysis, then yeah, we certainly didn't convert all of the Xenon one-ton runs. That would have taken way too much disk space. Yeah.
I explain why. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, of course, if your run is in here and you could still get the error, that would be quite odd. Okay. Right, so that's dealing with metadata. There's a couple of functions for changing the context. So we have set config, set context. Config, which I already mentioned, for changing the context options. You've got registration, registering all for registering plugins. You've seen them in the tutorial. And there's creating a new context with the same option. You've also seen that in the tutorial. Sorry, Aaron, did you have another question, or did you unraise?
Yeah. So that's estimate run start. Basically looks into the run metadata and look into the start time.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So you might wonder why we have that function.
Looking into run metadata, get time start, and that's what I was using as timestamp for the run.
Yeah. Yeah. So just so estimate run start. Let's try that. Estimate run start. Right. So all this will do is just it looks into the run metadata and finds the run start time. But there can be situations where the metadata isn't available, but the data is. For example, if I go into this folder and I start deleting some of these JSONs, then the metadata is no longer available, the data is. That's not really a good situation, but it has happened also in somewhat earlier test runs. You know, you can end up in a situation where you don't have run metadata, but you have real data. So in that case, you can pass an extra argument to this function, for example, raw records. And if it then doesn't find this metadata, now it does, but then it would go into raw records and just ask, hey, what's the first, the start time of the first chunk? At least I hope that's what it does. It used to go to what's the first element, which is a bit worse, but really it's within so close.
So it's safer than just estimate the run start and then go into the metadata.
Yeah, so you can do get meta, and then so if you just do get meta, sorry, you can of course run metadata. No, I'm making a mistake. and get from this start. Slightly better way to do it is like this, because if you just call run metadata, it queries the entire run document, which, if you do it in a for loop in a script lots of times, that puts a bit of stress on the database. And this projects it onto start, so you only get the start time. But if you do this, you get a datetime object. So you might say, well, okay.
That's what I did actually. Well, whether this one or just run.
Yeah, no, so you can do that, but it's very easy to make a mistake there, specifically with the time zone conversion. So let's just look at how this happens in context.py here. Right, so it turns out that the correct way to do it is to, you need to do .replace and then time zone UTC. Then you take, and then you convert it into an integer. And this time you can see that even it's a bit of a funny way. So there may be fractional information stored in the run start time timestamp, but we actually throw that away. You might say, well, that's bad. Maybe it is. But that's how we also use it in the DAQ reader. So you want to be consistent with what it was done when the data was being built. So, and I guess the DAQ only until quite recently has become very precise in the start and the stop times.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right, so there's these functions for changing the context. Yeah, not much to say about them, I think. You can probe the context by a variety of functions. So there's search fields to find the data type by a field. Just quick demo, so search field. Right, if I want something related to an S1, then it will tell me, okay, these are the data types that you may need to load. You can do the reverse thing by data info, where you said, hey, I have event info. What does it provide? And here you get all the fields. Okay, seems like some are left out. This is probably some convenience option from Pandas. Okay. And finally, there's some for probing the storage. So we'll look into more of these next week. So you can, for example, get the lineage or the data key. You'll see what that is in next week's reading for some piece of data. But for you, the most relevant is that you can ask whether the data is stored or not. And if it's not stored, maybe you want to make it. Okay. So if you want a little exercise, I won't do this here, but you could start drawing lines, sort of which connects to which and which function calls what. But yeah, this is not exhaustive. There are many context functions that are not in here. There's some, well, not many. I think this is most of them. But there are some very low-level ones, and there's ones related to run selection, which I also defined in a separate file. So it's sort of a separate thing. So that's sort of the context. That's in a way, maybe not the heart, but at least the head of Strax. Any questions on this this short intro before we dive into the code? Okay, then let's move on. So let's start with, from our reading, the Straxferno context file. Right, so this is where the different Xenon contexts are defined. Any questions on this?
So I think I already asked once before, but I forgot what the answer was. So why is there a LED context that is actually not so different from the wonton, from the enton context?
Yeah, that's a that's a good question. Let's see. So the main difference is that you check which data is available, and that we only register the LED calibration. So we don't register any of the other plugins. So I guess the idea was that if you're an LED analyst, you load this context, and then you don't have to worry about accidentally asking for peak basics or something, because if you try that, it'll say, I don't know what peak basics is. So you have to first register the plugin. Maybe the mirror of that, but that no longer applies, is that originally the idea was to only register this LED calibration guy here and not in the main context. But that no longer applies. And at least I think it no longer applies. We are registering the LED calibration.
Yeah, you were showing it just now. It's on the...
Yeah, I see it. Right, and for that, I guess, you know the reason, right? It's just for online processing that you don't want to switch the context if you have an LED run going by. So I don't know if that's enough reason to justify having a separate context, but that's the reason we had. Maybe it isn't necessary anymore.
So one edge case that at some point someone is going to run into, and then there'll be a question posted on Gitter. So in the Enton online context, we have the "We are the DAQ" option. Is the best way to handle this having something that an unwitting analyst could potentially override and then not know why their context isn't working? Because it feels like there are some very well-defined usage cases where the context should know if it is the DAQ. You know, if it's running on ebstar.xenon.local, and it's almost certainly bootstraps, and therefore it is the DAQ. You know, if it's not running with on a machine with a host name that is one of the event builders, it's not the DAQ.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's something we want to put into this, but it just seems like if we have this as an option that someone loading could decide, I want to see what happens if I do this. And now all of a sudden they're hitting the database with write, or they're trying to hit the database with write permissions.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, then you have to rely on the database permissions for that to go right. And of course, we do have database access control, but yeah, it's not ideal. Yeah.
That usually have
go ahead.
right permissions, right, to do that. I mean, I guess not everyone in.
Yeah. So the default, if you're running the default environments, you won't have permission to change the runs database. You need to activate a specific file.
There's seen on an online context, and I'm the DAQ, so it wouldn't happen, right? Because
yeah. But I think the question Daryl is asking, hey, but the write request will still go out. I mean, it will try to write, and if we configure the database correctly, it will refuse. But what if we make a mistake?
okay.
So
Yeah, it's sort of the one line of defense versus two lines of defense.
Yeah.
You know, if the database credentials are the only line of defense, there's potentially, you know, obviously it's unlikely someone would have to overwrite the environment variables to be the right access credentials. But if we have, so instead of having, you know, one line of failure where it's just relying on the database access, you know, if it's two lines of failure where someone has to basically spoof the machine host name to be one of the DAQ machines, I feel like if you're going to that lengths, then I don't know actually what you're doing. But yeah, I mean, it makes it almost impossible to accidentally try to do something like that.
But I think you wouldn't get there because you would need to have the password as well to get into the database as a writing client, right?
Yeah, that was the point that we made, that usually maybe the write request would go out, but nothing would happen because you don't have this password, so you don't have the username, password, credentials to actually do it. But yeah, I see the point here that, so the reason this option was introduced is that you might run on the event builder a notebook, which is not the DAQ. So it's not just a matter of checking what is my host name to know whether you're the DAQ. But you do point out correctly that, well, certainly you're not the DAQ if you're not on the event builder. So if you try, we are the DAQ, but you're not on the event builder, I don't know what you're doing, but that's not regular operation. So maybe you should make your own context to do that. Don't use this one.
Also a brief tangent based on the line of code that Jorwan's referencing here. Completely unrelated. I don't know if anything's currently running on the old gateway right now, so maybe we want to pull that out of the URL base. I don't think it's actually doing anything right now. I think it's just idle.
So old gateway, is that referenced here somewhere?
Yeah, in the run database file in Straxon, line about 90 also, I guess 92.
Oh yeah, here, you're right.
I don't think we have a mirror running on old gateway anymore.
Yes. Yeah, we should probably take that out. If there's no mirror there, there's no point. We should be adding other stuff in here. In fact, Chris has an open pull request to add Rise in here in the default URL for the runs database. But yeah, we can also replace old gateway. Yeah, good point. So this piece of code we're referencing is the storage front end for the RunDB. We'll look into storage front ends next week, and this will be part of the optional reading list. So don't worry if you're seeing this for the first time, thinking, what code is this? Okay, let's see. Aaron, you had a question.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's for this within this scope or for the next week, but I have a question about the hashes in Strax. So I couldn't find anything where I define a context and it gave me a hash table that I can look into where are the hashes for every single data type. That's how it works, these hashes, or?
So yeah, we'll discuss it a bit more next week, but I can give you an answer. So the hash is sort of a condensation of all the settings for a plugin. So yeah, let me just get a single plugin right now. Oh, sorry, typing on the wrong screen. Here we go.
Because once you have a set configuration in context, all the plugins have set with the configuration, right?
Sorry, Aaron, what was your question?
Yeah, so once you set the configuration for your context, all the plugins have a configuration already set. So then in that case, you are writing the hashes.
So that's actually not what happens, because the hash can depend on the run number too, through several ways. So one way is default per run. So you have in Straxon some plugins, certainly in the Xenon Wonton era. So let's look at, that's actually here in context.py, I think. So in the Xenon Wonton section, oh, not here, the other contexts.py. Right, so you, well, not here. No, it is in, yeah, it's because in these high level plugins we didn't. Right, so here you have default per run in an event positions plugin. So it says if you have between 0 and the first SR1 run, use this file, and between this and this, use this file. That's one way. Another way is the run doc can actually specify an override for the configuration. Currently, that option is disabled because computing basically told us that if we start changing the hashes run by run, they will come at us with a blunt axe and do all kinds of horrible things to us. So they're not happy with this because changing the hash, yeah, that means you have to keep track of several hashes for a data type, and the problem is more complicated.
What are those files?
Where are these files? You mean
What,
these
what,
files?
what are these? Are the hash tables, or
You mean these files,
Yeah.
or do you mean this file,
Yeah.
like event processing.py? You mean like this Xenon Wonton FTC SR1 file, or this event processing?
no? Those are just only the Xenon Wonton FDC.
Yes, so these things live in an auxiliary files, or actually these things live in packs, but yeah, they're just URLs. And this file event processing is just part of Strax and plugins event processing. So to your question of, hey, where's the table relating plugins to hashes? There is no such table because it will be different for every plugin. And I mean, I understand that your question is of course motivated by, hey, how are we going to do this for corrections? If you have a varying setting per run, yeah, then the hash is going to change run by run.
Yeah.
And if you don't want computing to actually grab their axe and come after you, then you probably have to invent a system where you track the hash for every run. So in that case, you can get that using a data key. So I can, I can ask the lineage of a run, like so, for a data type. So this is the dictionary with all the configurations and versions. And the data key, it's key 4. Not key 4. Right, so that contains the hash. You can also do here lineage hash. There you get the actual hash. So that's the function to do it. But again, we will look into this more next week. Then we'll get to see what is this data key, where is it passed through, and those kind of things.
For every plugin, do you have a hash then?
A hash is based on a lineage, which is a whole set of options and versions that apply to a piece of data. Given a context, a run ID, and a data type name, that uniquely maps to one hash, because every context contains the complete information on how do you need to process every run and every data type. So then I give it the data type which needs to process and the run, because some settings may depend on a run. So that's what you see here. You need a context, a run ID, and a data type name. And those three map to a unique hash.
Jelle, in principle, you could get the same hash if you have two contexts with exactly the same options for the given plugin, right?
Yes, right. So I can just copy this context, new context, which has exactly the same options, but it's a new context, and I get the same hash. Yeah. Yeah, so I probably shouldn't say that it is really the context, like the complete implementation of everything. It's only the configuration and the plugin registry that determines this.
Yeah, I think that was also why at first my question about the LED context was more relevant, because I thought, now the lineage is going to change, but actually all the options are the same, so it doesn't really matter that you have a different context as long as the options are the same.
Yeah, so like raw records is the same in both contexts. Yeah. Yeah, good point.
Well, yeah, we can discuss this more next week, because
yeah, let's do that.
Thanks.
Okay. Good. So let's return to context.py. More questions on this this file, where all of the options in the different contexts are defined. Okay, looks like not. So then let's move on to context.py. So now we're in Strax, we're no longer in Straxen. So this is a huge file. It wasn't completely on the reading list, but just this long list of options and the initialization basically. So any questions on that? Right, so it was clear to everyone what all of these options do. I hope it wasn't, since several options we will only discuss in like 4 weeks. So if you already know what allow lazy does, then. But okay, yeah, the main thing here is just to see that there are some context options. You can yeah, set them on initialization.
I had one question more about the ideas behind it. So run selection is actually basically a file that extends the context. Why did you decide to put it in a different file rather than add it to the class itself?
Yeah, yeah, so you're completely right. So if you look at the run selection, let's just open that. Run selection. Yeah, so I called this decorator, which all it does is it sets attributes, it extends the class. But yeah, I could have just added these as class methods. The reason is that this file is already like 1164 lines long. And I think you get into a different text bracket once you exceed like 1,000 or 1,100 lines. Yeah, that's all really. So just grouping these things together, putting them in one file. The mini analyses actually also use this mechanism, right? When you're calling a mini analysis, that also works with context dot and then your analysis. So here in mini analysis, you will see that at the end, it also calls this context add method. So it's just registering itself you know, dynamically. So given that we had this mechanism anyway, I used it for this too.
Jelle, since you already brought it up yourself, what does allow lazy do?
What does allow lazy do? Okay, and okay, so what exactly lazy mode is, we will get into in the 9th circle of Straxferno. This goes into some behavior of mailboxes, but basically what it means is that when you have a chain of plugins that are processing, to do fast multiprocessing, you don't want to process one thing at a time. You want to load like the first plugin must start processing maybe 20 things at a time. At least if you're on one of the event builder machines. If you start doing one and then the next one, and then okay, then the first plugin can do another one. You maybe only use 3 or 4 CPUs at the same time. So sort of normal mode, which is not the default mode, but the non-lazy mode, before lazy mode was introduced, was that mode where if you started the processing in multiprocessing mode, it would go all out and every plugin would try to pull as much as it can. That proved to be a little bit unstable. And it's not really necessary if you're just processing on one CPU. So in lazy mode, that doesn't happen. The plugin will only start processing something if it's asked by another plugin that, hey, we need this data, give me the next file. Okay, then I'll process something. So it's a way of, you know, getting a bit more stable data flow at the cost of no longer supporting multiprocessing. So lazy mode isn't enabled when you do multiprocessing.
So this is like that if you would only have raw records and you would ask for event info, then it would time out for event info because it was still busy doing things. But event info already wanted stuff.
So if you ask for event info, then there's like a chain of 20 things it needs to do from raw records. If you have allow lazy on and you're doing single core processing, it will get one bit of raw record, one bit of the next, and then things will get at you. It will work just fine. It won't time out. if you disallow lazy mode, what could happen is that it starts by asking for 20 different raw records things, does that first, and then it takes really long before you get to event info, and then you might get the timeout. Yeah.
Thanks.
So lazy mode was introduced to stabilize this, so you don't have to worry about this other thing, which maybe some of you remember. There was a time where, depending on what processing you're doing, you have to set this max messages option to something. And if you didn't set that right, you would get a mailbox timeout error, and that is no longer the case, thanks to this lazy mode. Okay, but the details, we'll wait until the very last lecture of the course, because it's a mess. let's be honest.
It's in the mailbox, so don't look at it.
yeah, it's bad. Okay. Right. So more questions on this this context initialization.
The default timeout there is 1 entire day, yes. 86,400 seconds. Mm-hmm. Is this reasonable?
That is a good question. So I think the default timeout has varied by infinite orders of magnitude, since I think it was infinity at one point. At some point it was 30 seconds, and then like 60 seconds and 1 hour, and now this. This is completely unreasonable for multiprocessing, because in multiprocessing, okay, so first of all, this timeout option exists because Strax is an application with multiple threads, and you can end up in a condition that basically different threads are waiting on each other and nothing will ever happen. It's called a deadlock. And in that case, it's not really nice to stay alive forever. It's nicer to at some point say, yeah, nothing has happened for, in this case, 1 day, let's shut down and give the user a nice error message saying we got into a weird state. So previously you had to like fine tune this timeout. If you set it too short and a plugin took too long to process something, you would crash due to that timeout. If you set it too long, you got into other problems also relating to this mailbox business. With lazy mode, I have yet to see any deadlock. Maybe I haven't explored enough, but I don't think this should happen. So the only way you can crash due to the timeout related, so basically the timeout's only bad. It only, if you have some plugin that takes long, it will at some point crash unnecessarily. So that's why we certainly want it longer than an hour in the default mode. And yeah, we just put it to a day. But in multiprocessing, where you actually can have deadlocks, this is not a good setting.
Don't worry, there. All the EBs are not set like to this value. They override the default time.
Yeah, if Bootstrax decides to sit around for a day, that's 20% of or 33% in normal cases of our live processing is enjoying the content.
Bootstrap checks how big the runs are and then decides, oh, this is a reasonable timeout, like 200 seconds or so, but not this much.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah. Yeah, on the other extreme, you can imagine some like single core processing job churning through in a gigantic run, and then a day is not so bad. Though at some point somebody's going to be really mad at me because their job takes 25 hours and after 24 hours it timeouts, but okay. Let's see. It doesn't actually time out just because the job is busy. It times out when nothing happens. When, at least according to some plugin, nothing is happening. So, but again, let's look into that more in lecture the 9th circle when we get to mailboxes. Okay, maybe a few things to point out. There's this storage converter mode. Maybe we'll get to it next time, but just to remember, if you want to convert one day from one kind of storage to another, there is that. There's this fuzzy loading. Again, something we might get into next time, but you can say, hey, for this plugin, if I just want to load it, I don't really care what the options are, just load it. That might not work. It's a bit of an experimental setting, but again, keep it in the back of your mind in case you need it sometime, then you have that. All right. Okay, then I guess we go on to run selection. Unless I missed any more questions on the context initialization.
Yeah, just about
Sure.
this. Register all. So register, we saw already how it's used, but register all. I mean, just if you can comment a bit on this.
Yeah, sure. So I'll show you one place where it's used. Here, register all. So in register, you need to give it a plugin class. So for example, peak basics or event positions. But sometimes you have a file with many of these defined. For example, here I have event processing, which contains lots of these things. So it contains event positions, corrected areas, all kinds of things. So rather than listing all of them separately, I just say here, register everything from that module, which in Python corresponds to a file in 99.9% of the cases at least. So that's what it does. It just goes through that file and then registers everything that is registerable in that file. So you can see here, it goes into the module. Okay, if you pass it multiple ones, then it calls itself. It lists everything that's in there. What does this do? If the type is not, oh, okay. So if it's, okay, so this line checks if it is a class. So if you have a class, then the type is a type, but you can't do this because type is a built-in function. So that's not the type. The type of a type is type. So yeah, sorry, I didn't invent this either, but okay. The main thing is this: you check if it is a plugin, and if it is a plugin, you register it. So that's what it does.
So one other thing that I did think about when looking through this. So register and register all take either an actual class, I guess declaration, or an actual module. Mm-hmm. Someone is going to try passing in a string at some point, you know, the name of the module, the name of the class, and it's going to fail. And it's probably going to fail in a way that doesn't make any sense to them.
Okay, well, let's try it. I mean, this is why we have.
You know, the name that they're giving might be valid.
So
I was wondering if it's worth adding in a check, you know, if is instance module string.
String has no attribute name. Yeah, that probably sounds as a confusing error message. Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't really tell someone, you know, why does this not work? So I'm wondering if it's worth adding a check, you know, if what the person is passing in is a string, you know, fail with an error message, you know, give me an instance of a string.
Yeah. Yeah, that might make sense. Though I think it will be hilarious to ask someone to see someone asking what camel to snake is and how does this relate to what I'm doing. But yeah, you're probably right that these like top level user defined functions might need to do some input sanitation. Currently, we usually don't do that. It's just if you pass the wrong type, you're gonna get a weird error message. Yeah, that's I guess the disadvantage of using Python. Though I don't know if a big sec fault would have been better, but okay. Okay. But yeah, those are things that we can add. Okay, so let's move to run selection. I don't think we assigned the whole thing in the reading list. Yeah, just select runs. Any questions on this? Because we already talked about how it gets added to context.
Also, yeah, on this, maybe the only thing I didn't get was this ignore underscore. I don't get where the underscore is.
Yeah.
Where it can be.
So this is at least a historical thing. I don't know if it still exists in Xenon Menton, but in Xenon Wonton, there were if you had a tag in a run, like bad or messy, some of them had an underscore, which meant, I think that only Dan could edit them, or only analysis coordinators or something. But the tag was actually different than the tag without the underscore. Like underscore bad is a different string than bad, but they should mean the same thing, right? It's bad. It's not like there's bad and there's bad according to Dan. There was like, it's bad. So what Hax did and what this also does is, if there's an underscore at the start of the tag, we ignore the underscore. But yeah, at some point, maybe an analysis coordinator wants to actually find out which things have an underscore and which not, because that might indicate something, and then you have this option. So it's like one historical thing piled on another. I don't even know if these underscore tags will be used, but that's what it is.
Okay, it sounds a bit like a mess we inherited from the, okay. Maybe. Okay.
It's ignored by default, so it's at least a mess you won't see.
Yeah. So in general, like this, it should work, it's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, more questions on the run selection.
I guess not strictly on the run selection, but at least on the tags. So actually selecting tags is an order n cubed operation because it's 3 nested for loops. This is right down at the bottom of the file.
So that's tag selection.
Because you have, for I in tags, and then you have for tag in tags, and then for pattern in patterns. So it's 3 nested for loops.
That's true, but that doesn't mean it's n cubed, right? I'm not going through the same list 3 times. It's just that there is a nested structure, and if you want to go over all of them, then that's what you're doing.
It's still 3 nested for loops, and that just seems
that's true.
Like that just seems super inefficient, especially once right now there's only 8,000 and change runs, but at some point there's going to be 20 or 30,000, and each of them can have 1 or 2 tags, and then just doing tag selection could end up taking a while, especially because it's nested for loops, nested Python for loops, which are not particularly CPU efficient.
Yeah.
At some point, it may be worth coming up with ideas on how to do that one a little bit more quickly.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think in Xenon Monton it wasn't a relevant speed consideration, but there is some number of runs at which it certainly does become a speed consideration. You could imagine sending off a RunDB query, for instance. This just operates on the small little bit in memory, because usually that, unless indeed you have a very large number of runs, doing a couple of for loops in memory is faster than call back and forth to the RunDB, but that could change. That's true. Yeah. I think in terms of speed, what will first become a problem is the availability check. That currently, when you initialize a Strax context, it for several data types looks whether the data is actually available. And currently, because we have this changing hash per run ID, you have to actually build the entire plugin infrastructure to even figure out what the hash is for that run ID. So for all of the runs, it's building like the chain of plugins, extracting the hash, going to the next run, doing the same thing. That is really inefficient. So that we have to change first before for anything else in terms of speed, I think. Unless in 1 year you want to be sitting there waiting for 10 minutes when you initialize your context, checking availability.
Well, it's just like calling hacks.init or even just loading hacks.
It's worse, but yeah, it's the same kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, more questions on run selection. So if you ever need to like rescan the database because it keeps a cache of the needed fields, then you call scan runs instead of select runs. So scan runs will requery the database. Select runs, right, you saw that here, it only does that if you haven't done it before. That could be relevant if you have some script that needs to scan the runs database for like new entries or something. Then you want to call that occasionally, not just select runs. All right, then let's get to our final piece for today. That is the configuration. So I think that was spread over several files. Mostly it's this config.py file, the option class. And we also had here set plugin config. It's a bit unusual that you are reading this, but you didn't read the function from which it was called. But you can imagine that this is called somewhere when the plugins are set up for actual use. So, any questions on the configuration system?
So the get default by run argument, which, I mean, in principle, this seems like a really useful thing.
Let me just see where it is. So,
it's in config, or at least it's defined in config.
Yeah, okay. Default.
Just default by run, probably. So, I mean, you've got some comments there that this is legacy code and at some point is going away. So what is actually the best way of storing this configuration information for values that can change run by run? You know, thinking of like electron lifetime correction, which is, I mean, we hope it changes run by run. We hope it's always increasing. So
yeah.
What provisions do we have for actually dealing with this kind of you know, temporarily varying corrections, but actually getting them to track properly?
Yeah. So the short answer is that Aaron is working on a system, and he's talking to several people from several groups, and that will come up with sort of a synthesis on how to handle these options. So that is, I think, the answer, like how are we going to do it? To give you maybe a bit more insight, let me just sketch a couple of things that you can currently do in Strax. One is you can change in the run doc a default. So you can put in the run doc somewhere in Strax defaults, electron lifetime is this. And then if the context doesn't specify an elife, it'll use that. Big disadvantage of that, and the reason why in the context put .py, this is currently disabled, so you actually cannot use that currently, is that there's no record of this apart from what is there in the run doc. So if you change the run document, then who knows what the original option was. It's not stored in any kind of version controlled system. So then it becomes really hard to reproduce the results. But we have the option anyway, because for like a small TPC, you might not care. You might just want to like quickly put the options in there. And this is how it worked in Xenon Montan, by the way. The other one is, as you mentioned, is default per run. Yeah, and okay, so this comment, I added it when computing basically told us like, we can't have this hash changing run by run. But maybe there is a way of doing that. For example, if you know, that is maintained nicely in a table of just looking up per data type, what is the hash for that particular run. In that case, you can use this default by run, and yeah, an example of that is just in Straxferno. Where we showed that here already, so you have to see this default by run. Third option, and the one which at least at the time when I wrote this comment, I thought we would go, is the one that is currently used for the gain model, at least in Xenon Montan. So this is something that Peter implemented. Then you have to go to gain models. But you can have a gain model that says it's run dependent, but you can go to a file and that little file will contain all of the possible gain settings for every run. So there's one file that maps every run number to a gain number. You can have the similar thing for electron lifetime. I think you can already see the big disadvantage of that. Every time you update it, all of the runs will need to be reprocessed because it's a different file. So then everything has to change. So yeah, all options have their problems. Aaron is working on a correction system which will hopefully combine the best of these worlds. This is the option. These are the options that Strax gives you. Of course, for Xenon 1 ton, it doesn't matter because yeah, nothing will change anymore, we hope. So this run by run specification of the option seems quite reasonable. Okay, more questions on the configuration system?
It's actually related to one of the questions we had to do as our homework. And that is how to redirect only one plugin to write elsewhere, or was it that the whole updated context had to write elsewhere? Because if it's the former, I have no idea how.
Yeah, me neither. So indeed, so the question you referred to was here, where was it? This one. So create a new context from which, sorry, am I looking at the wrong ones?
No, it's 4. It's the lone hits, yeah. It's the second question.
Yeah, okay, so that you can do because, so if you look in context.py, contexts.py, this is actually done. So you see here, right, so this is context.py, Xenon and online. You see here, there's the take only option being used. So you can specify when you do these storage front ends, hey, I take only these data types. So that in this case are the ones provided by the DQ reader, so raw records. So what you can do is you can add here a storage front end. Example here, Xenon Anton, lone hits. Let's not make it read only, take only, lone hits, like this. So that's how you would make sure that only one thing is added to that thing. And if you want to prevent the other storage front ends from storing that too, there is an exclude option here. Exclude lone hits over here. Now I don't blame you for not finding this because we're only going to discuss storage front ends next time. But I put the question in here since we, maybe there was a way of figuring it out from the context.py file, which does use this. But that's how you would do it. Of course, I'm changing it here now in context.py, but you don't need to do that. You can also do it in your notebook. So suppose I have here this context and I want to modify this list of storage front ends to add one where you only store records. Well, then I would append, right, let's see what this data directory was. I would just append this thing here. And then all lone hits would go to this, this folder. Or you can create a new context, with storage equals maybe only this.
Yeah, so that's what I did. Basically, I just added the path there in a new context, but that puts all the new stuff you create, I think, in there.
Yeah, if you don't have this take only option, you're right.
Yeah.
Then it would put everything in there. The reason I said when you first asked the question, I don't know that either, is because I thought what you meant was lone hits could be provided by several plugins. In this case, it doesn't. It's only provided by pulse processing, but for example, raw records can be provided by the DQ reader or by the PAX converter. There's no way to say well, if it comes from the PAX converter, then it needs to go here. And if it's from the DAQ reader, then it needs to go here. That's not possible because they both produce the same data type. They will go to the same folder in the same context. Of course, you make a different context, you can redirect everything to a different folder, but this is done by data type name, not by originating plugin. Okay. Right. More questions on the configuration system or the homework or anything else?
Yeah, if you could talk about this difference between regular option and context option.
Sure.
I didn't really have an answer for this. It was a study question for today.
Yeah, that's right. Right, so the regular options are stored here in config and the context options in this separate dictionary. So the regular options control the data processing. The context config control sort of the context itself. So an example of a config option would be the gain model, the correction neural net, the peak classification options, those kind of things. An example of a context option would be, do you want to use multiprocessing? Do you allow the use of shared memory? Or let's see some other ones. Yeah, what if you create a runs database or any storage front end? What run document fields do you want to store? What fields do you want to, when you start the context, what data types should I check availability for? So they're sort of meta options to Strax itself, if you will. So these sort of correspond to the things that you put into hex init or in the hex.ini file, whereas the plugin, the regular options would correspond to the PAX init and the PAX files. They control the actual algorithms. Does that make it clear, or?
Yeah, let's say that the list we are seeing now are context option that.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are others available, or just the list we see is comprehensive of them. Or?
Yeah, this is all because there's only one context. Now, perhaps somebody will at some point say, hey, I'm going to make a subclassed context, which has some fancy new options, and then there will be new ones. But currently that hasn't been necessary. So these are the context options. There's a fixed list unless somebody changes this. Whereas the plugin options, well, there's like a whole bunch of plugins yeah, depending on which ones are active, different options can be meaningful or not.
Okay, thanks. I would say it's clear. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, looking at the time, I think I want to give you a very short preview of next time, and then we can close. So next time we're going to talk about the storage system. So you already just saw sort of the entry point of the storage system. That's the storage front end. So that's just deciding basically where converting just, I want this run this data type to something like, well, then you need to look on disk in this directory. You'll see a backend which actually controls the interaction with files. There's also some aspects like loaders and savers that we'll get to later. The reason I put this still in the inner circles of Strax is because of the things you just saw. Like you can end up in a situation where you want to maybe place some things in some folder or you just want to make sense of, right? When you see here, you open some folder. Fortunately, I chose a very large one, so it needs to render this list. But you'll see a lot of files here. So what's going on with this? What does it mean? What sort of format is this in? How would you maybe change this? If you're part of the data transfer development team in computing, you maybe want to connect this to Rukio at some point. How would you go about doing that? Various reasons why it's interesting to know a little bit about the storage system. It's really a layered system where there's several things, but I hope the study questions will guide you a bit through it. In general, definitely for next week, I'd recommend if most important thing is to get the big picture without getting lost in the little details of how like subdirectories are parsed, etc. Okay, that's all I had for today. Thanks everyone for all the great questions today and your participation, and see you again next week.
One question before you leave. Maybe can you and Joran stay, because we both did the last of the exercises that we discussed the result?
Sure. Yeah, and you can all follow that discussion on GitHub, where you can see the pull request that these guys made. Sure. Very good. See the rest of you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jelle. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
So I just have seen that Joran put a lot of comments.
It looks like more than it actually is. It's just suggestions. I think we had more or less the same idea.
About one thing, I have a question with the Strax invalid configuration. You say you're not encountering this?
No.
That's odd. Because I always get it for options which are, I think, inherit from the context itself, like if you have the channel map as an option. Then I get this Strax invalid configuration.
Okay, yeah, maybe it is because I am using, which context am I using again?
So I checked with the current Xenon Anton context, it's working, and without this addition, in this except, it wasn't working, because for, as I said, for these context options like channel map or whatever, I got this error message.
Okay, yeah, I was using one tone I see now. Maybe that's
Okay, guys, I think I will leave you guys to this excellent discussion. Please don't let me interrupt you, but I'll get some water and some rest. So,
okay.
See you next time.
Okay, see you.
I'll leave the meeting, but I'll leave it open so you can keep discussing.
Okay, thanks.
Let me see. Maybe I think my first context was. No, I think I also get it for, but anyway, if you get it, then there's one reason to put it in there, and that's a valid reason.
So for the other changes you mentioned, I think most of them were very valid. I think this one with the values, yes, this we can do.
Yeah.
No.
It's just suggestions. I thought let's compare and see what the difference is. And
yes, the already seen. Okay, this Jelle already answered why with this is needed. Yeah, okay, I think we can also put there 0 instead of 1. It was just that you, for this get default, you need to specify the run ID.
Mm-hmm.
And as also Jelle said during the meeting, this is a legacy problem which may be changed. But I can put 0 instead. It's fine.
Yeah, I think 0 is used more throughout the context initiation anyways, if I'm not mistaken. I've seen it somewhere else before, although I don't remember where. And searching for 0 is not the most productive way of going about it.
Yes.
Here, it's actually in data info, for example. In context.py data info, there they also use run ID as 0 as the default.
Okay, yeah, then I will change it to 0. Perfectly fine. Yes, okay, this one with the values. Provides. Am I not also using provides in the printout? No, I'm not. Okay. Also doesn't make sense to return provides. Oh, then I will change also this items to values. Fine. and with your correction of my error message, also fine. I agree, yes.
Yeah, but looks good otherwise. First I thought, how can these things be the same? But actually, if you look at it a little bit more, they are actually the same, more or less. And it's great that you run into this error before we make an update to Strax, and then everybody gets this error.
Yes. Everyone calling Xenon Anton context error.
Yeah, that would be bad. All right.
Sure, if this is the context actually, or are certain context options tested for this kind of thing in these unity tests, in these hypothesis tests?
As in, if we would change this, if you...
For example, if I would produce this error message, I think the normal hypothesis test would catch this error and tell you this is the error.
Yeah. So maybe you can share your screen showing what the error actually was, because I haven't been able to reproduce it. But
oh, yeah,
if you
sure.
have it open.
Yes, let me just go to the notebook. So I think you can now see my screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I also wrote two new dummy plugins, which take certain configs. This was just explanation in case someone was interested. This we said already. So let me just remove it. So if I now register one plugin, and so if I...
Does try work without an accept?
no, it's not.
You can just probably, yeah.
You know, it should work. Okay, so if you have a plugin, this works. Yes, strange, okay. Interesting, now it's working. What have I changed?
I also don't know where Strax invalid configuration is usually raised. Let me see if I can find it.
As you have also this, the very same concept in this, I think in these, either in show config or get default, default config.
Plugin config, yeah. Show config also has it. So it's if you do not get a default at all.
Maybe because I'm not registering a plugin currently which takes one of these channel maps. Which plugin is taking channel map as an option? I do not remember.
I don't think any of them.
Some of them.
I don't remember, I must admit.
Pulse processing. Yes, pulse processing takes one of them, for example. And TPC is a... Let's check with pulse processing. Ah, yeah, now I get it. Missing option, invalid configuration.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Good catch.
Yeah, it was just by chance.
Well, it's nice that you run into it.
Okay, perfect. But I will update the stuff according to your suggestions, and then I think we're good to go.
Great.
Perfect. Have a nice day.
Yeah, you too. See you soon. Ciao.